All right, guys, welcome to the much awaited part 2 of Ruben's birth story. I feel a little bad for leaving you guys hanging on that last video. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to work as I was editing it, but when it turned out to be 18 minutes, I decided to split it into 2 videos, and I thought that I would be able to make this video like the next day after I released the first one, but as you can probably guess, having 4 kids is pretty time consuming. So a few days have passed. We're finally sitting down now to record the rest of the story. During the first video, it was kind of like vlog style, and I was doing a lot of the recording throughout the process. But at this point in the story is when I was totally beyond being able to record myself. And so the rest of the story will be told kind of by us. We're gonna narrate it, and I will show you the little bit of video footage that I have from the hospital, and then we actually had a professional photographer there, which I am so thankful for, because I will be able to show you guys some really incredible, high quality, professional pictures of the whole process as we kind of tell the story. I do want to mention that the first video was pretty PG, and I didn't have to really go into a lot of messy details, but I will say that this second part is kind of when the, what would you call it?
Bloody?
The more, the more messy side of the labor and delivery, because it's actually when he's delivered, so obviously it's a lot more graphic. There's no like nudity or anything like that, but you will hear words like amniotic fluid and placenta and blood.
And moist.
And moist. So if that bothers you and you don't like hearing about that kind of stuff, then don't watch this video, please. There are some pictures that I would call graphic. There's no nudity, but they're pretty graphic, and they show birth in all its reality. To most people that's considered beautiful, but there are definitely a percentage of people who do not ever want to see that kind of stuff. So if that's you, please do not finish this video. I also quickly want to say that I have him here on purpose because throughout the rest of the labor story, I was in so much pain that my perception of how it all went was very skewed and probably not to scale as far as like how things happened and time. And so he obviously has a much better recollection of it because he was more coherent during the process. So I have him here to kind of help me tell this story because he remembers it much more vividly than I do. So we left off at the birth center, and the midwife had listened to the baby's heart rate with the Doppler, and during the contractions, his heart rate would go from the 140s and go all the way down to like in the 70s, which is extremely low. And that was low enough that she really felt like it was necessary for us to go to the hospital. At that point, she said, I have to kind of suggest that you take an ambulance, but the hospital was so close. She was like, you know, you can say no, but I have to suggest it. So we just said, you know, we're gonna hop right in the car and drive there. It's probably gonna be faster that way. Actually, our birth photographer walked in the door as I'm getting my clothes back on from this whole thing, and I'm like, sorry, change of plans. We're actually headed to the hospital. You know, just get in your car and follow us. We're gonna leave right now. We get in the car, and she's following us, and actually my sister was on her way to the birth center at that point. Ironically, she had forgotten her phone at our house earlier that night, and so we had no way of getting a hold of her to tell her, like, we're not going to be at the birth center. Thankfully, she caught the last person as they were leaving the birth center, and they were like, go to the hospital, that's where she's at. So my sister showed up really shortly after we got there, which was great. The people that were in the room at the hospital were my husband, my sister, who both have been at all 4 of my births, and then we had our birth photographer. I will also say that a really awesome piece of this whole story is that our midwife from the birth center was able to come with us to the hospital, and all of the midwives at the place that I was going to for care have privileges at the hospital. So in these situations where you have to get transferred, they are able to come with you and still be there and deliver the baby, which is pretty awesome because, I had built relationships with all these midwives and built a relationship with this whole practice. And it was really reassuring that my care didn't have to be transferred to, some random doctor that I didn't know. But our midwife was able to stay with us, and she was the one that ultimately delivered the baby. So we get to the hospital and we get all hooked up to the monitors and we listen to baby's heart rate because that's kind of like why we're there. Like, okay, let's make sure he's okay. The ironic part when we get there is that his heart rate is totally fine. It never goes down again. It stays within normal range even during contractions. From the moment basically we get to the hospital, which is amazing, and that's exactly what you want. From that point, it was kind of like, okay, baby's fine. We don't have to worry anymore that like he's in danger. I was fine, he was fine, and so then it's just kind of like, all right, let's keep trudging through this and have a baby. We got to the hospital a little bit after midnight, and I had to finish my doses of antibiotics because it had been 4 hours since the last one because I was GBS positive. If you don't know what that is, Google it. So I got my last dose of antibiotics through the IV, and I would say at this point I was coping pretty well with contractions. I was able to breathe through them. They felt very intense, but like I was managing. I was able to keep myself calm. At this point, I think I threw up for the first time. I ended up throwing up twice. That's usually a pretty good sign, although it wasn't comfortable at all. Usually when you throw up, it means that you're getting towards the end because it's your body just kind of preparing itself to deliver, and it's kind of getting rid of everything you have. It's pretty common to throw up during labor. So although it wasn't fun, I was kind of relieved when it happened because I knew that that was just another sign that we were like getting closer towards the end. So then after that, I decided to get into the tub in the bathroom. I was able to, stay hooked up to the monitors and get in the bathtub. So I got in the bathtub, and that was really when the back labor started to get. All right, little man isn't happy, so I'm gonna hold him, and I probably will have to feed him at some point during this video, but we'll just keep at it.
So once you got into the tub, as she mentioned, the back labor kind of kicked into a higher gear. It wasn't anywhere near the pain it would get to. One of the big things that the midwife showed us is how to do counter pressure on the lower back, and kind of go to left and right of the tailbone, or you can go up a bit, or you can put pressure right on the tailbone, or go up a bit and put pressure. Some of it's asking for feedback, the other is just knowing that you just need to be there putting counter pressure on it.
Just breathe through this one.
So Lauren stayed there for probably half an hour, 45 minutes. which really wasn't that long. It might sound like long for some people, but the previous labor, she had labored hours in the tub. So in this case, the tub wasn't nearly as big. It wasn't set up quite like the birth center tubs. It was more like a large home tub, not like a 2 or 3 person tub, which is what the birth centers are set up with. So after that was kind of done, she got up and we went back to the bed. This is where I want to say, at the moment that she came back to the bed was where I would say we probably started to round out the top of the roller coaster. So the midwife gave this picture, which was helpful to talk about how labor there's kind of a long ascent, and at some point you start to plateau, and then there's a long descent. The problem is that, of course, time doesn't actually fit into those two pictures. It's just you can either be on the back half of labor or on the front half of labor. So after she got out of the tub, she threw up again. And this isn't like a nice little throw up. This is like retching, just the body getting everything out that it can possibly get out. So after the tub, she labored leaning on a ball, kind of knees on the ground.
That was the last time that I really allowed myself to be in a different position, because at that point the contractions were not so intense that I was like out of my mind, but they were intense. But I was like, okay, let's try a new position, because a lot of the times when you have back labor, it's because the baby's facing the wrong way, and so basically the back of their head is rubbing on your spine, where the back of the head should be on the front side of you. And so if the baby's facing the wrong direction, oftentimes they'll have you change positions and move your body a lot in hopes that that will shift the baby into the right position for labor to progress a little quicker. And so if I was having back labor at that point, and so everyone was saying, like, let's try new positions to move the baby. So at that point, I was okay with trying this position. I leaned over the ball. I wasn't really in that position for very long, maybe through several contractions. And then I just really wanted to be sitting kind of upright with my legs, either straight or bent. And so after leaning on the ball like that, I sat on the bed, and that's kind of just where I stayed for pretty much the rest of the labor.
What would happen is essentially the longer that she was on the bed, the worse the back labor got. So this would continue to escalate. And it escalated until, let's see, she's probably in the tub from 12:45 to 1:15 or so, 1:30. And so from about 1:30 to probably 1:45, it just got worse and worse and worse. She threw up in that time until eventually she started on nitrous oxide.
So it was at this point that I decided to try something called nitrous oxide, which is, it's actually something that they give you at the dentist's office, but when you get it in labor, they give it to you in a much smaller dose, so it doesn't really knock you out, but it does affect kind of your cognitive state. It doesn't take away any of the pain. You still feel the pain, and it's just as painful, but it's almost like you're less aware and you care less. When I first started breathing it in through the mask, I immediately got extremely dizzy, and I felt like if I was standing up, I would have absolutely fallen over and passed out. But I was sitting, and I remember my head kind of rolling around because I was just so dizzy. And in that moment, it was kind of a relief in the sense that it was just something different, and it, distracted me from the pain, even though, it didn't take the pain away. And so for a good while, I, was using the nitrous oxide, and it's self-administered, so you just kind of breathe it whenever you feel like it. It comes into your system quickly, and it leaves your system quickly. So if you want it to work, you have to basically continually be using it. The nice thing about this is that there's not a lot of risk with it. It doesn't pose any harm to the baby. It doesn't, have any lasting side effects. So although it really didn't do a whole lot, I think it was worth a try. And I think I ended up using it for about an hour. And I would say that it was worth trying because it kind of got me through that 1 hour. After that 1 hour, I just kind of got sick of using it. It smelled really bad and it like left a weird taste in my mouth. So I just kind of got annoyed, and eventually like I just kind of chucked it and was like, I'm done with that. Because I think that was really the point that things were ramping up, and it was getting so bad that I just kind of realized this isn't gonna do anything anymore. And kind of the newness and freshness of the dizziness was wearing off. And so then I stopped using that at that point. So we had only been there for, 2 hours, maybe a little more. But in my head, I was thinking that we had been there for, 4 or 5 hours. My perception of time was completely off because of the amount of pain I was in. And so I think this was really the point that I started to have a lot of doubts in my head, and I may not have been verbalizing it quite yet, but I really started to think, these contractions are way more intense than my other labors, and I had back labor. And so the combination of the contractions being so intense, coupled with back labor, and the fact that I had been in labor that whole entire day, since I woke up in the morning. And now we're like heading into night. I haven't slept at all. And so I just kept thinking, like, if this is going to go on for, who knows, 5, 6, 7 more hours, I just don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have the energy. And those doubts just started creeping in my head. And the funny thing is, like, I've been through this enough times that I know that that was the point of transition. So there's a point in labor which they call transition, which is usually like Phil was explaining in the analogy of the roller coaster, where you're peeking over the top of the roller coaster and you're about to like start your descent towards, having the baby. Usually it's at that peak where you're like at the very top, where the pain is absolutely the worst you've ever experienced. That's where you start having those doubts. Mm-hmm. And you start, because it's just so unbearable, and you just feel like you can't go on anymore. And I know that. I experienced that with my other labors, and I even saw someone else experience it when I was at a birth with my friend, and she went through the same thing where she was in transition and she had doubts, and she said, bring me to the hospital, I want an epidural. And it was a matter of an hour until she had her baby. And so it was like weird to be in that moment and to know that I was probably close, but it was still so bad, like the pain was so bad that I wasn't able to really like think straight and just like push past it. I was like, I'm sure this is transition and that's why I'm having these doubts, but I don't care, like I can't do this anymore.
So it was about 2:45 is when this all started to boil, when you were done with, it's probably 10, 15 minutes after you're done with the nitrous oxide that you started to say, I can't do this. And that concept of I can't do this would escalate, and it escalate over the next several hours. It would get to a point where the statements were, help me. The back pain, it's too much. I can't do this. I can't do this forever. And that's where I saw really you experience something different that you hadn't experienced before, because seeing how you had dealt with the pain previously and being able to breathe through it, being able to even grit through it or moan through it or kind of groan through it, or even just saying, and I had definitely heard you said before, I can't do this. But the difference here was that it wasn't about exhaustion nearly as much as just pain. Mm-hmm. And so it became clear that the pain was more that you had experienced. And it was getting to that point. What had happened is the pain was to the point where you had said, I want to know if I'm progressing. because she had checked you at before I went to the hospital. She didn't tell us dilation or anything because we didn't ask. But at 2:45, she checked you again, and you were very adamant and said, if I'm not progressing, I can't do this anymore.
And in my head, I had already started having thoughts about the epidural, and I don't think I had mentioned it yet, like verbally, so he didn't know that like I was already thinking that. But it was bad enough, and it was to the point where I started thinking like, okay, let's figure out some options here, because I can't continue. So I wanted to like move things forward, and that's why I asked her to check me and to see how dilated I was. In all my other labors, I always request that they never tell me how dilated I am. That's just something that I feel like is beneficial for me, because I know that, you can be stuck at a certain number for a really long time, and you can be a number and progress to 3 numbers up, within a matter of a half an hour. Focusing on the numbers, I think, can often hinder just like getting through it. And so when I was at the birth center for my other labors, it really helped me, because I never knew, okay, you're at this and you're this far from a 10. You just you don't think about that, so you just go. You just do it, you do what you have to do, and you don't think about it. This time, that was obviously my plan, and being in the hospital created a very different mindset for me, because it was like, knowing that the epidural was there and was an option. That's never been the case for me. I've never even had an epidural as an option. She did check me at the birth center before we went to the hospital, and didn't tell me how dilated I was. She needed to check me so that she knew for her own, information to assess the situation. So anyway, at this point, I have her check me at the hospital. So when she checked me at the hospital this first time, I wanted to know if I had progressed from where I had been at the birth center. When she checked me, she said, yes, you're progressing. And that was at the point that she explained the whole roller coaster thing, and how I was like over the top of, the peak of it and heading towards the descent. But she was honest and said, I can't tell you how long it's going to be. I can't promise you anything. All I can tell you is that you have progressed, and you are, you're on that kind of hump where it's really hard, and you're having doubts because, this is that just the hardest part. All this time, I'm just continuing to labor. There were periods of time where I would have 3 back-to-back contractions. So a contraction would last, what would you say, up to
10 minutes?
Between 5 and 10 minutes. It was just like they didn't stop. So it was like a 5 to 10 minute contraction of just the most excruciating, pain that I've ever felt in my life. When she had checked me, she said the head is now engaged. It's not floating like it had been when she was checking me earlier in the day. So, obviously I'm getting closer. Obviously, the pain of the contractions is an indication that things are progressing and I'm getting close. When you're in the midst of that type of pain, it's just like you'll do anything to get relief. And it's so this is actually one of the reasons that I chose to deliver at birth centers for all my other births, and that's why I wanted it for this one, was because I know myself, and I knew that if it was an option, I would take it. And in my head, I justified wanting the epidural because it was so much harder than I expected, and because it was so much longer than I expected. My last labor with my 3rd child was only 6 hours start to finish, like the first contraction to having him. So in my head, the whole pregnancy, we kind of would joke about how, oh, this one's going to happen super quick. Maybe it'll happen in the car. Maybe we'll have an accidental home birth. And I never expected it to kind of drag on all day and then last this long, and then on top of it to have the worst contractions and back labor. So anyway, I'm thinking in my head, like, that's my justification for getting the epidural, and we're at the hospital, why not? So then about half an hour after she checked me, I said, check me again. Because at that point in my head, I had decided if I'm not a 9 or a 10 and like about to push, I want an epidural. Phil very kindly tried his best to, reason with me, and because he knows deep down that that's not what I wanted for the birth. And ultimately, he could see how much pain I was in, and he kind of just let me be able to make that decision because, it's like no one else can understand where you're at that point with experiencing that. So I was very glad that he handled it the way he did, and he didn't shame me and say, I was being weak or anything. He understood that that was my decision to make. I'm sure it was kind of disappointing to be there and to have me saying that that's what I wanted after this whole time of thinking that I'm gonna have this all natural birth in a birth center. So she checks me again, and basically what she said is, do you want options or do you want numbers? And at that point I said, I want numbers. It's I don't care that I said I didn't want to know how dilated I was. That was out the window a long time ago because this birth isn't going any way that I thought it would. So then she said, you're a 7, which is what I was the previous time she checked me. And then she told us at the birth center when she checked me the first time, before we got to the hospital, I was a 4. So I had progressed from a 4 at the birth center to a 7. 7 is typically around, transition. Usually 7 or 8 or 9 is kind of that period of transition where it's just so hard. I think at that point I had really already made up my mind that I wanted the epidural, so there was kind of no turning back. So this was around 3:15, and so I said, give me the epidural. And so that's when things started to happen. The nurse said, okay, we got to start you on IV fluids in order to get your epidural. So here I am thinking okay, I'm going to get the epidural and it's going to be amazing. And little did I know, it takes forever to actually get the epidural when you ask for it. So all this time continuing to labor through these terrible contractions, it's just you don't have a choice. They come whether you like it or not. And so Phil's there just being amazing and helping me through them, and my sister's there rubbing my feet, and just their words of encouragement are honestly what got me through. And I say that about every single one of my labors, is that especially when you don't have any sort of pain medicine, their words of encouragement are basically the fuel that get you through, because you get in your own head and you're having all these doubts, but then you have these people right next to you saying you can do this, you're strong, you're doing amazing. So they start the IV fluids, and they say, we have to get at least half a bag of fluids in you before we even call the anesthesiologist to come. So they're running this bag of fluid, and I remember after a while looking up at the bag, and it was still so full, and I'm just are you serious? We have to wait this whole time? Here I was thinking okay, give me the epidural, and then boom, I was gonna get it. All this time, Phil and my sister were trying their hardest to convince me to move positions, because I was still sitting, upright with my legs out in the same position. And, they were thinking, come on, we got to get her to move, because then the baby will shift and then it'll just happen. But, at the point that I decided that I wanted the epidural, the midwife had mentioned something called a nap. At the point that she said the word nap, I was yes, that's what I want. I don't care about anything else. I just want my nap, okay? So they're hey, let's try this position. Why don't you get on your hands and knees, or why don't you sit on the birthing ball, or whatever. Nope. I would not move, because in my head, I just wanted that nap, and I didn't care. It didn't matter if I moved, or if the baby moved, or if anything else happened, because I was getting my epidural.
So the IV bag was started officially around 3:15, right after 3:15, after she was checked. From 3:15 to 4, that IV bag was running. During this time, this is when I started to hear those different words come out. I can't do this. My back. I'm in so much pain, help me. Like, these are things that she had never said before in any other labors. And so I knew that this was much more painful than she's been through before. We both, I can see it, I get it, she needs something more. So we just kind of fought through the next 45 minutes. At about 4 is when they had enough of the IV bag down to start the epidural process. So the paperwork came out to sign it to say, yep, we consent to all the risks. And at this point, this was the first time in an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours, that she had moved from the bed in this one position. And so at this point, in probably 2 hours, she moved from sitting on the bed with her feet on the bed crossed or out in front of her to being sitting like she's in a chair. So feet on the ground, off the gurney or the hospital bed, and then just sitting upright. So,
which is the position that they put me in order to get the epidural. So she kind of moved me to the edge of the bed in preparation for the epidural.
So what they did is they start talking through, here's what's going to happen, talk about the epidural process. During this time, Lauren stopped having the intense contractions. She'd have a contraction here and there, and they were intense, but they weren't nearly consistent. She was not having 10-minute contractions. They didn't appear to be as debilitating.
I just remember, like, because the midwife was sitting right next to me as I'm, just on the edge of the bed. And I remember she was explaining to me all the things about the epidural. Okay, he's going to come. This is going to happen. You're going to do this. And there was, like, this one period of time where it was, like, probably, I would guess, like, 5 to 10 minutes where I didn't get a contraction. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is really weird that I'm not having a contraction right now, because there were times where they were just back to back. I didn't really know what that meant, and I didn't really care because I was about to get my epidural, so I was like, whatever. But it was really nice because it was giving me a little bit of a break. And maybe it was because I had finally moved positions and, I don't know what was happening in there. Essentially, I'm sitting there at the edge of the bed in about between 4 and 4:10. I feel something shift, like something changed, and I felt something, I guess you would call it pressure. I put my hand on the bed and I kind of stood up, but my butt was still kind of over the bed, but I was kind of standing. And all of a sudden my sister is behind me, so she's, just standing behind me, and I kind of push myself up off the bed, and she kind of looks under my butt and goes, "The bag is out." And so what had happened was my water had kind of, my sack of water had popped out of my body. And so it was kind of like a bubble of amniotic fluid popped out. And this had actually happened with my last labor, and I was in the birthing tub that time. But the same thing happened where the bag comes out and it's just fluid in the bag. And at that moment, I remembered that, and I went, that's what happened right before he was born, literally seconds. So my sister goes, "The bag is out." And I think at that point, the midwife and the nurse started freaking out because they realized what that meant. So they're scrambling, running all over the place, trying to get a gown on, trying to get gloves on. No one was really thinking something's about to happen, and I'm standing there pushing myself off the bed something's happening. And in a moment, I just knew it was time to push. I pushed one time and I could feel his head coming out as I'm standing there over the bed. Jenna, my sister, is behind me, and she goes, "The head is out." So at that point, thankfully, the midwife had her gloves on and was able to reach down under and kind of guide his head. And with one more push, his body came out and he just kind of flopped on the bed. There was amniotic fluid and blood absolutely everywhere. I must have had a ton of fluid in me because it was like a waterfall off the side of the bed. It was covering the ground. The whole bed was soaked, and it was absolute disbelief that literally all in one moment, completely unexpected. I wasn't expecting it. They weren't expecting it. The midwife and the nurse weren't expecting it, because usually there is some sort of like build up to that moment of pushing.
There's grunting.
Usually you start kind of feeling what they call pushy, where during the contractions you kind of start pushing, but there was like none of that. I didn't feel pressure. I didn't feel pushy until that exact moment, and at that exact moment I pushed twice and he was out. Now the best part about this story, and my favorite part to tell, is that basically as the baby was coming out and being born, the anesthesiologist finally walks into the room, peeks his head around the curtain hanging, and everyone goes, "We won't be needing you anymore."
There's 3 anesthesiologists with the full cart and all the anesthesia.
Yep.
And I turned to him and said, "Well, we just need you to come down the hall."
Yeah. So apparently the baby felt them coming and didn't want me to have an epidural, so he decided to be born right then. So then she lifts him up and I'm able to kind of pull him to my chest and sit down on the bed. And I just remember Phil being right behind me, and just like his expressions were just like complete disbelief, as I was feeling too, like just like, what in the world just happened? Like, how did that just happen so fast? I'm just so like thankful looking back at it that, you know, it happened the way it did. And obviously being in the hospital wasn't the plan. All you want is a healthy baby and a healthy mom, and that's exactly what we got. He came out perfectly pink. He didn't cry that much, which has been his personality thus far, but you know, you could tell immediately that he was perfect, and his breathing was good, and his color was good, and you know, there was none of this scary, like intense moments of like worrying about his health, except for, you know, the one moment at the birth center. You know, I ended up getting the natural birth that I wanted, and although, you know, I was pretty close to getting epidural, I'm just so thankful that it was able to happen in that way, where I didn't end up needing it, and he was born healthy, and it was an absolute whirlwind. From the 4 hours we were at the hospital, it was just like, it felt just, in the moment it felt very long, obviously, but then when I look back at it and I think about, you know, just the whole process and like how it happened, it's just like, you never expect these moments of like, oh, his heart rate's dropping, we need to go to the hospital, and like rushing to the hospital in the car, and then having these crazy intense contractions, and then him being born out of nowhere, like not expecting it. It's just, it was crazy. After it's done, you just sit there and go, wow, like what in the world? I ended up having a little bit of complications with the placenta coming out. I won't go into detail about what happened with that and that whole situation. Delivering the placenta was complicated, and there was some problems, and they ended up needing to call an OB doctor to come in and kind of help with that process. And so we were also kind of glad that we were in the hospital for that, because it was able to be dealt with kind of immediately, which can be kind of scary, because that's kind of the time after the delivery where hemorrhages can happen, and that's pretty scary for the mom's health. We were able to, you know, just be where the doctor was, and she handled it, and it wasn't a problem. I didn't have excessive bleeding. The placenta was dealt with, and my recovery has been nothing but, you know, amazing, very uncomplicated. So we thank God that it happened the way it did, even though it wasn't the way that we thought it would happen in the birth center. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that story, and I am happy to record it, because I know that we will look back on this for the rest of our lives and tell this story many, many times, and I can't wait for our kids and even this little guy to watch this one day. So this is the reason for all of this. This is Reuben Jacob. And he's getting hungry because we've been recording this whole time. But he is amazing, and he's very healthy, and he's been sleeping good and eating good, and we couldn't ask for anything more. So thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you later, Ren Fam.